It's a common trope of many horror movies for a victim to sometimes return or reappear to avenge the deaths of others or exorcise a demonic entity. Someone you thought had been killed actually never died in the first place. Then, with a final jump scare, the monster's reign of terror is brought to an end by someone they victimized, and the hold that they had on the community or a family is gone, and then peace returns once more. But that's only in the movies. In real life, we know that victims don't reach out from beyond the grave to help law enforcement solve a brutal crime and put their killer behind bars, except for when they do. And someone who thinks they've gotten away with murder realizes too late they haven't outsmarted anyone at all. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 37 of the Darklivity podcast. I'm your host, Kimbyr, and I'm here with my pumpkin spice of my life. And I don't mean my drink, but my husband, Jonathan.
Hi, Darklivity. It's the dark downward slope into the degradation of the human mind and the consequences that such darkness brings to light.
Guess what? We are back on our Actually Us channel talking about how I got pregnant and we had a baby. So if you are interested in more about us, you can look below and we will link that video for you. We're happy to be back just telling a little bit about our life, and we have a surprise coming very soon. We are actually redoing an entire house. It was built in the 1940s. We're renovating it and we're going to be documenting it on that channel. And I know so many people like to see before and afters, and this is going to be one for you. We'll put a few little clips right here on the screen so you can see what we're working with. But of course, today we have to get back into why we are here. We are going to be talking about another very heartbreaking and sad case. But we do want to also just point out that there are not that many pictures in this video. And I hope that doesn't deter you from listening. I know a lot of you like to listen anyway and don't even watch the screen. But of course, we're going to show you the important ones, the people in this video. But just bear in mind, you might be listening more than having to look at the screen. So first, let me introduce you to Patricia Lynn Vanderkar. Everyone that knew her called her by her middle name, Lynn. She was born to her parents, Arthur and Ruth, on October 20th, 1950 in upstate New York. 27-year-old Arthur and 21-year-old Ruth married on January 25th in 1930, and Lynn was one of their 7 children. The other siblings in her family, Lynn's sisters Shirley, Annette, and Sandra, and brothers Kenneth, Jerry, and Jack. But don't worry, you don't have to be remembering these names. You're not going to be quizzed on them. Just remember that they had a big family in a small town.
And at that time, it was home to just about 4,000 people and sat in the far eastern part of the state near the Vermont border. They were living in the rural community of Hoosick Falls.
It's a stunning area. It's surrounded by picturesque hamlets, beautiful rivers. There's all kinds of opportunities to go trout fishing and hiking, and the mountains provide a beautiful backdrop for the many Victorian homes and the leafy streets and farmland.
It really is a beautiful area, and it even inspired the renowned folk artist Grandma Moses. Her distinctive images, which are now widely recognized on greeting cards, captured scenes from places like this.
I've actually seen those cards and never heard of Hoosick Falls, so I truly learn something new all the time. This area also provided easy access to New England's surrounding ski resorts and lakes. All in all, this is a safe place for this large family like the Vanderkars to grow and thrive. But sadly, in 1957, when Lynn was only 6 years old, her father passed away at 54 years old. Arthur's loss was devastating for this family, but there was a lot of love in the Vanderkars' home. The children and Lynn's mom, Ruth, were close, and they were a warm family who knew they needed to be there for one another in a time like this. And as a child, Lynn began playing Little League baseball, and then later, she attended Hoosick Falls Central High School, graduating in 1968.
And just a couple of years later, 19-year-old Lynn married Robert Howard Steller. Known to everyone as Bob, the 22-year-old had been a couple of years ahead of Lynn at the same school, where they met and became high school sweethearts. Since graduating, Bob had finished an apprenticeship with Reynolds Tool and Die Company, where he had also worked alongside his brother, Howard Jr.
Lynn's love for baseball and softball continued into adulthood. She got into coaching. She coached both Little League Baseball and Miss Softball League. Lynn was a person who loved to give back, and she was known for her generosity and kindness to others. She also loved shopping, and even more so when she was purchasing gifts for other people. One of Lynn's good friends, Arlene, described her as being pure goodness. Lynn had at one point even dreamed of becoming a police officer so that she could help others in an even bigger way. But friends like Arlene knew that Lynn wasn't the sort of person who would march a suspected criminal down to the police station. Instead, she would be the type to buy them a coffee, listen to their problems that led them to their offending behavior. Sounds like maybe she would have made a good psychologist. Someone there to lend an ear and listen to people's problems. It's another great helping profession. But for the time being, Lynn took on an even greater role. On May 12, 1973, Lynn and Bob welcomed their first child into the world, and Lynn officially became a mother to Howard John Steller III, named after his granddad and his dad's brother. He was affectionately nicknamed Howie. And in August of 1979, the young boy, only 6 at the time, actually served as the ring bearer at his Uncle Howard's wedding. And in October the following year, the Stellers moved from Hoosick Falls to the resort town of Old Orchard Beach in southwest Maine.
Tragedy hit the Steller family on February 24th, 1981. Howie, who was only 7 years old and in second grade, was struck by a car as he crossed in front of the school bus. The heartbreaking incident happened right in front of his mother.
Wow, and that's exactly why there are so many rules that school buses have to follow, with like the stop signs that come out on the sides and the red lights and everything. And it's because of these situations, because actually it's not that uncommon, or it wasn't as tragic as it is. And no child should die just because they're going to catch the school bus. And the fact that this happened right in front of his mother, that is, like you said, so heartbreaking to know that she was unable to stop it. No parent should ever have to bury their child. And this was just agonizing.
Now that we have a child, or I have a child, I totally understand that fear. The fear of losing a child is horrifying.
And then just being out of control of the entire situation.
The pain and grief for Lynn, Bob, and their family were beyond words. Howie was brought back to Hoosick Falls, and after his funeral on February 26th, he was laid to rest in Maple Grove New Cemetery. When the driver responsible went to trial, Lynn read a letter she had written expressing her forgiveness towards the person who had taken her son's life.
But the devastating loss took a toll on Lynn. She began drinking a lot. But over time, she did manage to find the courage and the strength to begin her journey to sobriety. And she even began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. She was slowly healing, and almost 2 years after Howie's death on February 1st, 1983, while still living in Maine, there was a reason for Bob and Lynn to celebrate and be happy again, a reason to change their life around. It was a joyful arrival of their second son, Matthew Collin, and no doubt the couple was experiencing a range of complex emotions at this time. It was bittersweet, given Howie's relatively recent passing, but Matthew's arrival was a much-needed spark of joy, and Lynn would go on to describe Matthew as the light of her life. But at some stage after Matthew was born, Lynn and Bob's marriage unfortunately broke down. It's not exactly clear why, but we do know from, statistics and things like that, that it's an incredibly stressful time when you experience the death of a child. It can either bring a couple together or it can drive them apart.
Life's toughest moments really put the foundation and stability of a relationship to the test. Whether it's the heartbreak of losing a loved one, battling illness, struggling through financial hardships, or even building IKEA furniture, these experiences reveal how strong your connection truly is.
Or renovating a house. I've heard the divorce rate is high. That's not going to happen to us. But yeah, these things are challenging, and a death of a child would be way high up on that list.
In 1986, Bob remarried a woman named Therese McKean. Despite this, he and Lynn remained very close and dedicated to co-parenting Matthew. When Matthew turned 7, Lynn made a significant decision to move out to Middleton, Connecticut. However, Matthew stayed in Maine with Bob and his wife.
And this was most likely due to Matthew being in a stable environment. He was in school, and they probably didn't want to disrupt his life and uproot him. Bob also had a wife, and that might have been more of like a cohesive family unit for him, since Lynn was still finding her footing on her own. But Lynn was still very much involved in her son's life and adored him. I also considered the fact that he was now the exact same age as her previous son was when he passed away. And maybe that was hard on her. Everyone grieves differently. It was about a 3.5-hour drive from Maine to where Lynn was moving. But once she was settled in, she made plans to see Matthew as much as she could. Now, I personally do not think I could do this. I don't think I could be away from my child very long. But I also haven't been through what Lynn had, so I can't possibly put myself in her shoes. It wasn't long after moving that 39-year-old Lynn landed herself a job as a mechanic at Middleton's Wesleyan University's maintenance department, known as the physical plant, in July of 1990.
Even though Lynn was quite far from her family in New York and her son in Maine, she felt Middleton was the perfect place for a fresh start. The city, home to around 43,000 people, offered a relaxed, politically progressive, and family-friendly atmosphere with a cosmopolitan touch. Its demographic diversity was fitting for a vibrant college town, which also boasted a low crime rate. Many residents were young professionals in an affluent socioeconomic bracket, and the city had a history as a thriving port town.
Plus, it's one of those places where, especially during the fall, its historic charm makes it resemble something out of a Hallmark movie. And like Hoosick Falls, where Lynn grew up, it's nestled among spectacular scenery. So I can see why she loved it there.
The university where Lynn worked had a reputation as one of the top liberal arts colleges in New England, with nearly 4,000 students on its historic 316-acre campus. Wesleyan offered the advantages of being a relatively small institution. This size allows students to enjoy a more personal, collaborative, and interdisciplinary learning environment.
What I also noticed is there were as many students at that school as there were in her hometown.
Wow.
So, I mean, this was a big shift for her moving to this bigger city. And beginning this new chapter of her life, Lynn was still very much committed to being sober and attending the local AA meetings. She also loved the simple things. One of her favorite things to do was going to Roy Rogers restaurants for their famous roast beef sandwiches. But she was equally happy just enjoying a cup of coffee or even eating peanut butter right from the spoon at home. And that sounds pretty yummy. I've never actually eaten at Roy Rogers. I don't eat roast beef or any beef. But how about you?
I have never eaten at Roy Rogers, but I usually pass on the roast beef.
Have you eaten at Roy Rogers? Let us know. I just like to know because, it's a culture thing as well. And they're still around today, right?
Roy Rogers is still around today, but only in 5 states, with most of its locations in Maryland. When Lynn wasn't enjoying one of her favorite meals there, she would spend her spare time immersed in her passion for furniture restoration, upholstering, and woodworking projects. It was through this hobby that she met her first close friend in Connecticut. In the fall of 1992, 42-year-old Lynn met 24-year-old Gina Cochia while doing upholstery work for Gina's aunt, Margaret. Gina, who was living in Rutland, Vermont, about 170 miles away, had come to visit her aunt. As Lynn worked on Margaret's furniture, she and Gina struck up a conversation and quickly hit it off. They exchanged numbers and kept in touch, meeting up whenever Gina was in town. Their connection grew so strong that Gina even considered moving to Connecticut to be closer to Lynn, and they spent more time together.
Over time, there was actually something about the bond they shared that felt different to both of them, and they realized that maybe they could be more than just friends. So they decided after about a year of getting to know one another that they'd try being a couple. And in April of 1993, they started dating. Lynn, of course, had never experienced something like this before. It felt so right, though, and sometimes you find your soulmate in the most unexpected ways. Lynn had truly never been so happy. It was just effortless. And I know that feeling because that's how I felt with you right away. And we were also friends first. And sometimes it just grows into something more and something amazing that you would never have expected. Gina felt the same way, even though she had actually dated women, at least one woman in her past before Lynn. But she had never felt this connection before with anyone. And for Lynn, after the misfortune and tragedy that she experienced in her life, she deserved to find joy and light again. And Lynn would go to visit Gina in Vermont, and Margaret allowed Lynn to stay at her vacation home while she was there. The real next step that solidified the relationship, though, was when Lynn invited Gina to be her +1 at a family wedding in New York. And this was a big deal at the time when a lot of people, including some members of Lynn's own family, weren't as accepting of 2 women dating and weren't as accepting of gay relationships at all, like most people are today.
And don't forget about the 18-year age gap.
Right. Okay. So by itself, regardless of who someone's dating, an age gap like that can cause people to be judgmental. But neither Gina nor Lynn really cared. Lynn knew that she may get grief for being older than Gina, but she wasn't ashamed of Gina, and she wanted the world to know how happy she was with her. And just 4 months later, on August 13th, after graduating from college, Gina and her adorable pet Pomeranian moved into where Lynn was living in Connecticut.
Lynn's house was a split-level, 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom rental located at 14 Red Orange Road. If you're watching, we're showing it on the map now.
It's at the end of a cul-de-sac nestled among the trees, sitting back from the street in an affluent subdivision in Middleton known as Wesleyan Hills.
The quiet, upscale neighborhood where Lynn lived was home to many people employed at Wesleyan, thanks to its close proximity to the campus, only a 7-minute drive away. Lynn rented the home from Dr. Montgomery Winship, a psychiatrist who worked at the college, which is how she found the place. It's a nice, spacious house, so Gina was naturally excited to move in. By the summer of 1993, life was very busy for the couple. Lynn's 10-year-old son Matthew came to visit for his summer vacation to spend quality time with his mom. They spent their days enjoying walks, fishing, and swimming together.
Lynn made the most of their precious time together before Matthew returned to Maine. But soon, Lynn and Gina welcomed a roommate into their home. But it was someone that Lynn was very familiar with. He was family. It was Lynn's 25-year-old nephew, Ronnie. He was Lynn's sister Sandra's son. Ronnie, or his full name, Ronald Howard King, was born on September 10th of 1967 in Quantico, Virginia, to Lynn's sister Sandra and her husband Frederick. He was one of 4 children in the family. He had a sister and 2 brothers as well. Sandra and her family eventually moved back to where she and Lynn were born in Hoosick Falls, where Ronnie ended up attending the very same high school that they went to, Hoosick Falls Central High School, where he graduated in 1985. Lynn knew Ronnie was a good guy. She was close with her family, including him, and he was known as a handsome, sensitive, soft-spoken young man who had always been close with Lynn and both her sons, even little Howie before he passed away. They would spend holidays and family time together. Ronnie was devastated when Howie suddenly passed away, and Ronnie's amazing qualities meant that his younger cousin Matthew looked up to him as a real role model.
By the time Ronnie moved in with Lynn and Gina, he was training to become a professional wrestler and was already very talented at the sport. Before moving in, he had been living in Wethersfield, Connecticut, just 12 miles from Middleton. After moving in, Ronnie worked at various local restaurants until Lynn got him a job that August in the maintenance department at the Wesleyan University, where she also worked. Although Lynn, Gina, and Ronnie didn't socialize much with their neighbors, they were very social within their circle, often having friends over at their house. Despite their active social life, they were also hard workers, with Ronnie striving to excel in his job and Lynn setting a very strong example.
Another example of the type of people they were was what happened that September. A fire actually broke out in the Wesleyan dorms, and it resulted in multiple students being without anywhere to stay. And Lynn and Ronnie were quick to offer their home, even their own rooms, to the affected students until alternate arrangements could be made. This selfless gesture was deeply appreciated by the staff and the students, but they didn't end up needing to stay with Lynn. Life on Red Orange Road was happy and full of good times for everyone, Lynn, Gina, and Ronnie and their friends, with everything working out really well. The 2 younger household members, who were only a year apart, they got along great, and it sounds like such a positive environment. But soon, the unthinkable would happen.
As summer came to an end, Lynn's son Matthew returned to Maine. In October, Ronnie traveled back to Hoosick Falls to visit his younger sister Sherry, who had welcomed her son Ryan. This visit was significant for Sherry, and she and Ronnie hadn't been in close contact for over a few years. The birth of Ronnie's nephew gave them a new opportunity to reconnect. Now, fast forward to just a few weeks later, on the morning of November 1st, 43-year-old Lynn and 26-year-old Ronnie set off to work together as usual in Lynn's 1989 tan Ford Probe.
I had to look that one up because I once purchased a late 80s Ford Escort pony for $400 from a thrift store, but I hadn't heard of a Ford Probe before. And wow, it was kind of like, for back then, a futuristic sports car. It looked pretty cool. I mean, mine was not cool, although mine had pink flames on the side. This old ad actually reads, "The new Ford Probe GT, a performance you won't forget." And I was thinking, is that a sexual reference? I think it is. And they definitely don't make ads like they used to, because that for sure would have seemed offensive to some, right?
They don't make them like they used to.
But back to Lynn and Ronnie. As they left the house, they did their normal routine, including Lynn's habit of erasing any old messages from the home's answering machine. If you are of a certain generation, you'll know this was the only kind of voice message people had back in the 90s for their landlines. But the machine's effectiveness of recording new messages while you're out relied on you manually erasing the messages that were already on these small tapes inside the device to make sure that if you missed an important call, the caller would at least be able to leave you a message. But once the tape was full, if someone called your house, they wouldn't be able to record one. So an answering machine only worked as well as the owner allowed it to.
That day, Gina was the last to leave for work. She put her little dog in its cage and went through her usual routine of checking all the home's windows and exterior doors to make sure they were securely locked before heading out. It was the day after Halloween, so there was still a chill in the air and a hint of that spooky, lingering atmosphere from the night before.
Yeah, it was actually what's known as the start of the Day of the Dead,
otherwise known as Dia de Muertos,
when families, especially in the Mexican culture, gather to remember the deceased.
What happened next made everything even creepier. Around 5:30 p.m., Gina arrived home and saw Lynn's car parked in the garage. But when she stepped inside, the house was uncharacteristically dark. With no lights on, it felt strange. Everything was eerily silent, just a little too silent. Lynn and Ronnie should have been home by now, as their shifts had ended around 3:30 p.m., nearly 2 hours earlier. So where were they? Gina called out to see if Lynn and Ronnie were there, but there was no response.
Walking into the kitchen area, Gina suddenly tripped on something on the floor. Flipping on the light, Gina was confronted with the most surreal and terrible sight. There was blood everywhere. At first, she thought Lynn and Ronnie were playing some twisted late Halloween prank on her. They were laying face down on the floor in a pool of blood, both still wearing their coats and work uniforms. What was this? Gina could not comprehend what she was seeing. What kind of sick joke were they playing on her?
Gina's eyes caught the back of Lynn's coat, torn in several pieces. A chill ran down her spine. This couldn't be some elaborate joke. No one would go as far as ripping their own clothes for a prank. It hit her like a wave. This was real. Lynn and Ronnie were actually sprawled on the floor, blood pooling all around them. Gina started screaming, her voice breaking, and she actually shook them, desperately pleading for them to get up.
Gina still wasn't able to come to terms with the fact that she was standing in the home with two dead people. It could not be real, but as she looked around, she saw blood sprayed on the walls and the kitchen cabinets. It appeared that Lynn and Ronnie had either been stabbed, shot, or beaten to death in a sudden and violent confrontation, as though they'd been caught off guard as they came through the door because they were still in their coats. They hadn't even had a chance to take them off. Gina also noticed a 12-inch knife covered in blood up to the handle laying on the floor, along with broken glass, a lampshade, and shattered shards of a white ceramic lamp base. Trying to play detective in that moment is almost impossible with how much shock and stress a person is under, but Gina was trying hard to understand what happened.
The phone receiver was dangling from the wall. Gina frantically tried calling 911, but something was wrong with the phone. The line was dead. Hysterical, she turned and ran next door to the neighbor's house where Frederick and Mary Verdict lived. She banged on their door, and when they answered, as she tried to recount what she had seen, in a desperate panic, Mary called 911, while Frederick and Gina returned to where Lynn and Ronnie's bodies were in the kitchen. Gina hoped that somehow Lynn and Ronnie were still alive, but she soon realized they weren't.
Now there was nothing to do but wait for law enforcement to arrive. Middleton Police Department officers William Hurtler Jr. and Emmanuel Spona were dispatched to assess and secure the scene until detectives arrived. On the path outside, leading to the house, Officer Hurtler noticed what appeared to be drops and spatters of blood. Drops of blood were also on the front door, and as he walked inside, he observed similar stains on the home staircase, which is right in front of the kitchen, and blood smeared on the staircase wall. Given Lynn and Ronnie were both still wearing their coats, had someone somehow gained access and ambushed them? Or had someone taken a ride home with them maybe from work and attacked them as soon as they were inside? Either way, the victims had potentially been lying there undiscovered for almost 2 hours based on Gina's account.
This was all Gina's account. As officers Hurtler and Spona stood near the bodies, wondering who could have committed something so gruesomely violent, Officer Hurtler said out loud that it would be nice if Lynn and Ronnie could wake up and tell police who had murdered them.
And then, as if it were on cue, a click filled the silence. An electronic voice from the kitchen eerily said, "All messages are full." Officers Hurtler and Spona looked at each other in shock. It was like a voice from the dead had heard them. There was an answering machine on the kitchen counter where the voice had come from, and they wondered, was there a slim chance there could potentially be something useful on this tape if someone had left a message before the crime occurred? The thing is, they were unable to touch anything in this residence until senior law enforcement arrived. The officers would have to wait to find out if this spooky coincidence would lead to anything more. Soon, detectives Noel Perez, Robert Barone, and Rick Sienna arrived at the home.
As detectives processed the scene, they realized whoever attacked Lynn and Ronnie ensured they couldn't call for help. The phone line had been cut. The shattered glass appeared to come from a mason jar broken during the attack. A wooden knife block in the kitchen was missing several knives, and several bullet casings lay on the floor near the bodies.
On the kitchen counter was a blood-stained knife next to a bowl of Halloween candy. Another one was on the table in the dining room, along with a puzzle. All were smeared with what appeared to be blood, like someone had attempted to clean the weapons. So there's a total of now 3 knives, am I right?
Right. Gina mentioned seeing one on the kitchen floor, another one on the counter, and a third one in the dining room table. So it sounds like there were 3.
Wow, 3 knives.
A chilling trail of blood led from the front door down to the steps and veered alongside of the house, eventually reaching Red Yellow Road, the path neighborhood kids often took on their way to school. But then the trail suddenly stopped. It didn't seem likely that the blood outside was from Lynn or Ronnie. The scene painted a clear picture of an ambush. It looked like neither of them had the opportunity to flee from what should have been the safety of their own home.
And in our last Halloween case, we also talked about a blood trail leading out of the house very similarly. Canines were called to track the scent of anyone who had been in the home and could have fled. Only one dog managed to detect the scent of someone else's blood besides Lynn and Ronnie's, and this dog was tracking the blood leading away from the home, which led from the front door to that nearby pathway and then just stopped. This suggested that maybe the killer or killers had been injured during this vicious attack, and they made their escape by getting into a vehicle. That's why the blood wasn't going anywhere else. And this vehicle could have just been waiting or parked nearby. Law enforcement issued an alert to all hospitals across the entire state to make contact if anyone showed up seeking treatment for stabbing type or slashing type injuries. This is smart because, if they were using a knife and then they cut themselves and it's a violent attack, we know from the previous case as well, their wounds could be pretty deep.
And you might be wondering why they didn't just swab the blood on the path and then compare it to the DNA in CODIS, which law enforcement can routinely do today. CODIS had begun as a pilot project in 1990 and wouldn't be fully operational until 1998. This was 1993, so good old-fashioned police work would have driven this investigation until the actual suspect's blood could be taken to compare against samples from the crime scene.
That's right. So that meant identifying the perpetrator wasn't going to be easy. And sometimes we forget about the advances and even the luxuries that we have with today's technology.
The scene didn't look like one person murdered the other and then took their own life.
Especially if they were both stabbed. That's very unlikely. But we know that there was also bullets on scene, so that could still have been possible. But it didn't appear that anything had been stolen from the house either. Lynn's vehicle was still in the garage, so it didn't look like a burglary gone wrong. No one in the neighborhood had heard or seen anything. They didn't hear gunshots or even an injured person fleeing the area. This meant that, unfortunately, there were no immediate suspects either, except maybe Gina.
That's right, there was Gina.
Gina was covered in blood when the authorities arrived. Not only did she have access to the home, she happened to stumble upon the scene, find the bodies, and then call in the crime. She also mentioned locking up her dog before leaving that day, and that could be normal. Some people do that, but it set off a little bit of an alarm for the police. She also said that she touched the windows and the doors to make sure they were locked and closed. She also claimed she couldn't call 911 right away either because the phone wasn't working. And then she shook Lynn and Ronnie, which would excuse away the fact that she had blood all over her. All of this raised some red flags, but Gina told police that she'd been at work all day, but that alibi still needed to be confirmed by detectives. Her clothing and vehicle were seized for forensic testing until they could be sure that she was not a suspect. And of course, it made sense that she would be. She was in a relationship with Lynn and close in age to Ronnie. But what would be the motive for her to kill both of them if she was perhaps in some kind of love triangle with them?
At this point, investigators couldn't jump to conclusions about what had happened. The theory that one of the victims might have killed the other and then taken their own life was uncertain because the autopsies hadn't yet been conducted. So the exact causes of death were still unknown. While knives were found at the scene, there were also bullets, adding to more complexity to this case.
Right, so it was complicated. And the head of the State Forensic Science Lab, Dr. Henry C. Lee, who's actually pretty famous, by the way, and one of the people who made me interested in true crime to begin with. He was the lead forensic investigator on this case. And Dr. Lee has worked with over 7,000 major cases, including the O.J. Simpson trial, the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, and the reinvestigation of the Kennedy assassination. He's also testified in over 1,000 criminal and civil court cases. And he just happened to be the chief criminalist and director of the Connecticut State Police Forensic Science Laboratory at the time. And that is why he was assigned this case. And also one of the reasons I wanted to research this case. I took a special private class with him a couple of years ago, and maybe one day I will discuss the case that we focused on. But for right now, let's focus on this one. Dr. Lee, along with detectives Edward Kushner and William Guida Jr. of the Connecticut State Police Central District Major Crime Squad, worked through the night, gathering evidence and running theories. And they didn't stop. They worked right through the next day, gathering 68 pieces of evidence and dusting for fingerprints all over that house. As Dr. Lee examined the scene, he felt there had to be more than one person involved to be able to overpower two victims, with Ronnie being fit and a young man. And at that point, they didn't even know he was also a trained wrestler.
Despite the chaos, which was evident from the violence that had been inflicted, the blood pooling and spatter were largely confined to the kitchen itself. The undisturbed furniture throughout the home led Dr. Lee to conclude that Ronnie and Lynn were cornered in the kitchen when they were attacked. The kitchen itself was soaked with blood, in stark contrast to the rest of the house, which showed only a few smears here and there. This pointed to at least one of the perpetrators sustaining an injury and leaving a small trail of blood as they fled. Determining who was attacked first was pretty difficult for Dr. Lee, but he noticed that Ronnie appeared to have been shot. There were signs of at least one exit wound and one entrance wound on his back, suggesting he was initially shot while standing there and then again at close range after collapsing on the floor. Dr. Lee had speculated that either Ronnie and Lynn had let the attackers into the house or someone might have been lying in wait inside.
So this is interesting because Ronnie was shot. So if I was assessing what we know as of now, I would wonder if Gina could have been hooking up with Ronnie. And then Lynn somehow found out. She goes into a rage. She shot her own nephew. And then Gina ends up stabbing Lynn and then maybe put the gun down.
But where's the gun?
I don't know where the gun is, but there's just so many questions and theories.
Right, there's so many theories, and that could have happened, but what happened first? What if Ronnie stabbed Lynn because she found out about him and Gina? Maybe she threatened to kick him out of her house and he flew into a rage. And then Gina came home and stumbled upon this, and she got a gun from somewhere in the house and shot Ronnie. But it was too late for Lynn. She passed away, and then Gina staged the scene by stabbing Ronnie.
That's a pretty good one. I mean, that's what a lot of people do in the comments that I like is what could have happened in this situation? I mean, that's what the detectives are doing as well. We're not detectives. But in that theory, she could have also stabbed him to get out her anger for killing her girlfriend.
Exactly. And at this point, anything seemed possible. And just like us, the detectives were making educated guesses. But they were the professionals here. Fingerprint analyst Officer Ken Zersi found a total of 10 fingerprints at the scene. However, none of these prints were discovered on the knives, the broken lamp, or the pieces of the shattered mason jar. Also, an unknown bloody shoe print was also found on the floor.
So a shoe that didn't belong to Ronnie, Lynn, or Gina, I'm guessing?
That's what it looked like. The following day, November 2nd, Lynn and Ronnie's families came to Middleton from New York to meet with investigators, including Sergeant George Dingwall and Officer Wayne Linares. Ronnie's dad, Fred, and Lynn's brother, Jack, had gotten the devastating call from the police around 1:30 a.m. that morning, informing them of the tragic events.
Yeah, and Lynn's brother, Jack, was confused because at first, he thought that Lynn had been killed in a car accident. But he soon learned the awful truth, and both he and, of course, Ronnie's dad were deeply shocked and overwhelmed with grief, as were the rest of the family. They lost 2 family members at once, and as the news spread, none of Lynn or Ronnie's loved ones could understand it. Neither of them had any enemies, and they loved each other, so they felt like there was no way that either one of them hurt the other.
One of the hardest moments for the family was telling Lynn's son Matthew. He had just seen his mom that summer, and they had shared such a wonderful time together. Lynn had been so happy in Connecticut. How could she possibly be gone? It was almost impossible to process.
It seemed unreal, and some of Lynn's loved ones, like her brother Jerry, immediately suspected Gina, who, of course, was still being questioned. She was the first woman that Lynn had ever dated, and Jerry, for one, had struggled to come to terms with the fact that his sister was in an openly gay relationship. Like we had explained, this was a small town in New England, and it wasn't very common at the time. But thankfully for Gina, she was actually, and surprisingly, I would say, eliminated as a suspect. And I really thought she was involved. But her alibi checked out, and there was nothing linking her to the crime. The detectives felt they'd done their due diligence, and she was ruled out for now anyway. Unless they ended up finding new evidence that implicated her. And it was a terrible time for the young woman to be under suspicion, while also grieving the loss of her girlfriend that she loved dearly and the roommate that she had gotten along with so well and cared about. Gina ended up moving back to Rutland because obviously she could no longer live in the house. It was still a crime scene at the time, and she wanted to be closer to her friends and family.
Detectives also interviewed Lynn and Ronnie's coworkers, considering the possibility that work-related issues might have followed them home. The news of their murders shocked the university staff. Counselors were made available to help Wesleyan employees cope with the loss. College spokesman Martin Waters spoke to reporters, saying that both Lynn and Ronnie would be missed and have been valued good employees.
All this time, I keep wanting to discuss what actually happened to Lynn and Ronnie, so let's be as respectful as possible, but also discuss their autopsies and what it revealed. You start with Ronnie's.
The forensic pathologist performed both examinations. Ronnie and Lynn put up a fight for their lives. Ronnie had been stabbed, like first responders had initially noted, but those weren't the only injuries. In addition to sustaining 6 stab wounds, Ronnie had been shot 3 times in the chest and abdomen, once at close range. A stab wound to the chest pierced his windpipe. He also had stab wounds to the back of his head and 3 in his back. The pathologist, Dr. Nelson, could see that one of the bullets had actually exited Ronnie's back through a stab wound. This meant he had been shot after he was stabbed. He had also been struck over the head with a sharp object, consistent with the broken mason jar found at the scene.
Wow, so he was shot after he was stabbed. Now that changes a lot of things. This was clearly overkill. It seems so personal, which is why I initially suspected Gina, but they ruled her out. But then Dr. Lee said that someone had to be strong enough to overpower Ronnie. Someone was able to stab him again and again, at least 6 times. Lynn had been stabbed 14 times in the face, neck, chest, and back, with some of these injuries being inflicted while she was laying on the ground. They're actually able to tell because of the angle of the stab wounds. The ones to the right side of Lynn's neck and chest suggested that she was on the ground when they were inflicted. She had also been shot once. It was in the right shoulder, which penetrated her chest and her lungs. Lynn was also struck in the head with a heavy object, likely the lamp, which is probably how the item ended up breaking. She also had gashes to her face and neck, and the stab wounds to her back alone were 4 inches deep. So this was violent, and it was also personal. The fact that she was wounded in the face is one, just horrific, but it also is a sign that someone almost wanted to maim her, like to disfigure her. I mean, that's a very personal part of your body. You know, it's who you are. It's your identity. So now detectives imagine this could have been some kind of hate crime. Maybe Lynn and Gina were the targets because of their relationship. And maybe Ronnie just got caught up in the attack because he was there and the killer wasn't expecting that. But sadly, both Lynn and Ronnie had died slowly and in great pain. According to the doctor, they were laying there dying on the kitchen floor for up to 10 minutes after their killer or killers had fled. Now, while there is conflicting information in the research as to their causes of death, the gunshot wounds sustained by both of the victims were potentially fatal. And both the bullet and the stab wounds caused traumatic shock and blood loss, leading to Lynn and Ronnie's deaths.
At a press conference on November 3rd, Police Chief George Aylward stated that robbery did not seem to be the motive, and investigators were actively working to piece together what had happened. It appeared that Lynn and Ronnie had left work about 3:35 p.m. and taken their usual route home, traveling along Daniel Street onto Laurel Grove, and finally turning onto Red Road, where the Wesleyan Hills subdivision began. Law enforcement felt confident that this wasn't a random act of violence. At least one, if not both, of the victims knew their killer or killers. The crime was described as an intense act of passion, with the attackers using multiple methods to ensure their deaths.
Exactly, like I said, it was overkill. And it seemed like the person or persons had a lot of anger inside of them.
Detectives also suspected that after killing Lynn and Ronnie, the offender left the house on foot and got into a waiting vehicle. Later that evening, a canine search was conducted in the Wadsworth Falls State Park, which was near the Wesleyan Hills area where the pair lived. It seemed plausible that the killer or killers might have used the park as an escape route, but despite the search, the police dog did not pick up any evidence.
We keep saying killer or killers because at this point, with all the evidence, they were leaning towards there being two perpetrators. And one killer is bad enough, but this community was in shock and horror knowing that there were two psychos on the loose. The constant presence of law enforcement vehicles was actually very unsettling for the residents of the two streets that the police were focusing on. People were terrified. The fact that it wasn't believed to be a random act was not comforting at all. Things like this did not happen in Middleton. This was a quaint, sleepy New England town. Privately, even the detectives working this case were actually deeply shocked. This was like nothing they had ever seen in Middleton, and the level of violence inflicted suggested that somebody extremely dangerous was still out there and they could strike again.
Yeah, some neighbors were upset with how the police chose to handle the investigation. When the area was being canvassed, residents of Red Orange and Red Yellow roads weren't immediately informed that there had been a homicide, let alone two. When they eventually found out, many were angry that such crucial information had been withheld from them.
I think that's pretty understandable. They could have been in danger and they weren't even taking precautions because they didn't know. So, of course, now they're doing damage control. The chief and also a psychologist named Dr. Stephen Bank personally met with residents in the area to hopefully relieve some of their fears and to reassure them that police were doing everything they could to apprehend those responsible. Despite Lynn and Ronnie's neighbors being in a state of disbelief that they hadn't seen anything suspicious, some described some people walking through that area at the time, and this came from people near where Lynn lived. One witness, Lisa Flagg, had been driving to meet a friend when she turned onto Red Orange Road around 3:55 p.m. Lisa told the detectives she saw a man and a woman walking together, but they were not on the sidewalk. They were in the middle of the road, and that's why she remembered them. She said it was only a short street and she had to drive slowly, which gave her a really good about 15 to 20 second look at the pair, not just a quick glance. And Lisa noticed the man was wearing tight jeans and something like a cap over his head. She described the woman as having weathered, sunburnt appearance and shoulder-length dark brown hair. She had on an unzipped pastel yellow jacket, maybe a sweatshirt, and possibly corduroy jeans. Lisa thought the woman's outfit was really strange given the time of year. It was getting cold out, and a sweatshirt or a light jacket, that was not the kind of clothes that everyone else in this area was wearing. They were wearing full-on coats, so these two stood out. Lisa noticed that the woman's hands were positioned very oddly as well. Her right hand was kind of inside the right pocket of her jacket, but she was holding her left hand over the top of it. And it was kind of like she was trying to conceal something.
And I think that's where that gun is.
Exactly. And this is what we see in shows or movies. I know I can't do it on screen, but it's like when you're signifying there's a gun with you. It's almost like movies will be like, there's something here, they're covering it, holding it down, a gun in someone's pocket. So that's what this person was noticing when she's in her car that day. She's like, these people are looking weird. Lady's hands kind of positioned weird. Never seen them around here. Interesting.
On November 4th, investigators in Middleton, Connecticut reached out to the Rutland Police Department up in Vermont, where Gina was originally from and had recently moved back, and they wanted to ask for her assistance. Vermont is about 3 hours away, so the investigators were methodically contacting everyone in the victim's social and work circles, using a process of elimination to rule out potential leads and to gather as much information as possible. Detective Sienna discovered Lynn's address book in her home and began contacting each person listed. He was trying to gather information about who Lynn was and whether anyone she knew might have wanted to harm her. Among the list of contacts on the last page was the name Janet G. with a Rutland phone number.
What you're not seeing, but that I know from the evidence, is that this was on, like he said, the last page of her address book. And back then, you would fill your address book up. Now there's no space, okay? So what she did was she turned her address book sideways and she wrote it kind of like not on the spine, but like on the edge of the page. So this name wasn't straight like everyone else's. It was to the side, almost like an afterthought, somebody to just scribble down, didn't have a last name. So they were hoping, because they knew it was a Rutland phone number, that the Rutland detectives could help them identify who this Janet woman was. So they ended up narrowing it down to 47-year-old Janet Griffin, who lived at Morse Place, and it's spelled just like my maiden name, like the Morse code, which I noticed is like, oh, okay. Janet lived in an apartment in Rutland with her oldest daughter, Annette. So Lieutenant George Lang and detectives Barone and David Visconti traveled to Rutland to speak with Janet, who was actually a friend of Gina's and an acquaintance of Lynn's. She explained that she met Lynn through Gina. She said that when Lynn came to Vermont to visit Gina, they all got together for coffee and would sit and talk and hang out together. Janet said that she was at a complete loss when it came to understanding how something so horrible could have happened to people that she knew, especially considering that Gina was so happy with Lynn. It was devastating. And Janet was doing her best to provide Gina with the much needed emotional support following this double murder.
Janet explained that she didn't know Lynn very well, so she couldn't offer much information about her. Still, the detectives needed to eliminate every single person in Lynn's phone book, so they asked Janet for her whereabouts on the day of the murders. Janet confirmed that she hadn't been anywhere near Connecticut that day. She was a senior housekeeper at The Woods, an exclusive ski resort in Killington, Vermont, where she managed a team. However, she was off work that day and had gone shopping with a younger friend and coworker in Glen Falls, New York, about 175 miles away from Lynn's house in Middleton. The detectives needed to confirm Janet's alibi, so they asked for her friend's name. Janet told them she went with her friend Gordon.
But that's interesting because remember we said that reports came in about a man and a woman being seen in Wesleyan Hills around the time of the murders. Well, investigators felt like Janet could match several of the descriptions given about this woman in question. And now she's saying she was with a guy friend that day.
While the investigators are still interviewing Janet, they get 31-year-old Gordon Lee Fruin's information from her, and they give him a call and he comes down for a statement.
He corroborated Janet's account, telling them yes, they had gone shopping together in Glens Falls on November 1st. At this point, they're also examining him to see if he had any signs of injuries. And of course, taking note of his physical appearance. They don't notice any cuts or wounds on him because remember, they're assuming the killer had been injured at the scene. And at the time of this interview, Gordon was dressed in 3/4 length spandex shorts and a tank top. It was the 90s. You remember all the neon and the spandex? Yes. Gordon had a slender build. He wasn't a very physically intimidating person at all. He was actually the complete opposite, with somewhat meek nature about him. They made note of this because, of course, someone had to overpower Ronnie, who was athletic and strong. So it seems like Gordon could kind of be ruled out at this point.
As they continued interviewing Janet, Detective Barone noticed that she had a few cuts on her palm of her right hand and her pinky.
Okay, that is never a good sign. That's usually a red flag. But then I thought about it and I was like, let's look at our hands because, like, do we have any cuts? On any given day, I don't think you do. Unless you do like manual labor, I feel like people don't normally have cuts. So that's why it's such a big deal when they see them. And I can't even recall the last time I had a noticeable cut anywhere on my hands. But then again, like I said, I'm not doing any manual labor or anything. If I was even gardening, who knows? I could. But Janet explained she had been at work and she hurt herself while she was changing a light bulb. She was more than willing to provide a sample of her blood for testing, and the test results would take some time to come back. But the investigators weren't ready to eliminate Janet just yet, and this is why.
Because they inquired about Janet's relationship with Gordon.
Right, because they wanted to know if there was some kind of motive of some kind that they may have. So to get the full story here, they're asking questions about the relationships because they're trying to get to know Gina, who her friends were, and what their connections were to Lynn and Ronnie. So when they ask, Lynn says that Gordon was just a friend. But when they ask Gordon, that's when they realize they may need to look a little deeper.
He mentioned that he was gay, and so was Janet. She didn't date men. Additionally, Gordon revealed that Janet was actually Gina's ex-girlfriend.
Interesting. Now, it doesn't mean she's a suspect just because she used to date Gina. Besides, She lived hundreds of miles away, and they'd been broken up for at least a couple years. Plus, they were still close, and she had met and hung out with Lynn. According to both Gina and Lynn, they got along just fine.
Investigators still need to dig deeper, so they conducted a background check on Janet. It turned out that during her relationship with Gina, police were frequently called due to domestic incidents where Janet was the perpetrator. Additionally, there were also reports of disturbances involving Janet and Gordon, even though they were just friends.
I found that to be very odd. And Gordon is apparently meek, and he's thin, and he's, not big in stature at all. So yeah, that looks a little suspicious. But going even deeper, we would have to wait because on November 5th, Lynn and Ronnie's joint funeral was held in Hoosick Falls at St. Mark's Episcopal Church, and more than 220 of Lynn and Ronnie's family and friends attended, including many from Connecticut who had driven all the way to New York to pay their respects. In a moving eulogy delivered by Lynn's friend Arlene, she spoke of how Lynn and Ronnie shared an innate positivity. They had a great sense of humor, but most of all, they had a caring nature. Aunt and nephew were buried together alongside Lynn's son Howie at the Maple Grove New Cemetery.
But while all this was unfolding, detectives uncovered more compelling evidence that the perpetrators wouldn't have known existed. Meaning there was no way they could have hidden it, discarded it, or denied it. Remember when we talked about the phone line being cut and the home having an answering machine with a full tape? The first responding officers had heard that eerie voice playing from it while they stood over Lynn and Ronnie's bodies, asking for answers out loud. Well, that day after the murders, Detective Perez decided to listen to that tape for any messages that could hold a clue. What he heard was completely unexpected, but extremely telling.
A voice, or voices from the grave, if you will. Amongst a lot of background noise, sounds of a violent confrontation could be heard. A woman is saying, "I thought you were going to help me," followed by a second woman crying out, "No, please, don't do it, don't do it. He has nothing to do with this. Please, let him go." And then the first woman then said, "Butch, hold her." Now, Gina's dog barked throughout this entire tape, so it's actually really hard to hear anything that's going on because there was shouting, things were, breaking, there was heavy breathing, there was gasping for air, glass shattering, and the sound of clattering metal. The second woman was begging. She was saying, "No, don't, come on, please, I've got a son." Wow. I mean, to think about listening to that. And we're not done yet, but with the mention of the name Butch, the investigators stop because now they're on alert. They're sifting through all their evidence, trying to see if they've gotten any tips about a man named Butch. But wow, is that not crazy that this answering machine somehow recorded this? This recording was 7 minutes long in total, and we're not done telling you what was on it. But when they're hearing this, the detectives couldn't believe this was possibly the recording of the murders being committed. So Detective Perez actually reached out to Officer Linares.
Detective Perez and Linares listened to a 7-minute recording to confirm what he heard was real. Once Linares confirmed it, they played the tape for the senior officers.
Somehow, during the attack, a button on the answering machine was pushed, and it started recording, possibly unbeknownst to anyone in the house at the time. But maybe Lynn could have known how it worked. Obviously, this was her device, and maybe she pushed it on purpose to leave evidence behind. This recording feature on answering machines allowed someone to record a message while at home if they needed to head out and give someone else in the family something important to note, okay? It was like the 90s high-tech version of a handwritten note on a countertop. But what are the chances of that happening? It's pretty rare, in my opinion. But then it's evident by the fact that this woman is begging for her life that it's Lynn. She's the only victim who had a son, and that is so sad.
Detective Perez took precautions by breaking the 2 plastic tabs on the cassette tape to ensure it couldn't be recorded over.
I thought that was cool because I've recorded on so many cassette tapes and I don't remember these plastic tabs, but that's pretty interesting because there were so many times I didn't want my little sister to record over my mix. I didn't know that was a thing.
I didn't either. He then informed Chief Aylward, Lieutenant Lang, and Captain David Knapp so they could coordinate getting the tape copied and sent over to the FBI in Virginia. Their technical experts would enhance the audio and remove any background distortion for clearer analysis.
It doesn't take long for investigators to find out that Butch is actually Gordon. Yeah. And this surprised investigators Because remember, Gordon's physical attributes, okay? And it turns out that Butch was more of an ironic nickname, kind of like when someone really tall and muscular is named Tiny. So I'm sure you can probably guess that this implicates him and also Janet, because they were supposedly together that day. So investigators already knew Janet must have been involved, because remember, there was more to that recording. After Lynn yelled, "No, don't, come on, please, I've got a son," she said, "Come on, no, Janet, no." So she's calling Janet by name.
On the recording, a man whom investigators identified as Butch could be heard saying, "Do it." This is followed by clicking sounds, and then Lynn's voice crying out, "Janet, no." The tape captured what sounded like a struggle, followed by Lynn's desperate screams. "Ronnie, help me. God, please, no, Janet."
A man's low groan could be heard before this, and then Janet says, "Give me something, anything." And then it sounds like someone is rummaging through a kitchen drawer. And then Butch responded, "Here," handing her something. And this was followed by sounds of glass breaking. Now Janet said, "Butch, he's not done. Hand me something." And then Janet says, "No, get me a knife. That's not good enough." So she's asking for yet another item to use on Ronnie or even Lynn. It appears that Ronnie had already been shot and hit with something, the glass maybe. And then there was more smashing sounds. And finally, Butch can be heard saying, "Let's go," with Janet agreeing, saying, "He's done. Let's go." There was nothing more heard from Lynn. The only remaining sound among the sudden silence was the dog whimpering. How heartbreaking is all of that? And that it was caught on tape. But also, how amazing, because this is a huge clue. So we're actually going to be playing a portion of this now so you can kind of get an understanding of what it sounded like. They also believe at this point that it was probably an accident that this got recorded at all. They believe it was actually the killer that may have triggered the machine to record when they cut the cord. Remember that? Because they were right near it, they cut it, and they probably went somewhere near that answering machine. While investigators wait for the FBI to enhance the audio, they went back to speak with Gordon, or shall I say, Butch. What did he have to say now that this incriminating tape had all this evidence on it? Which was still circumstantial, but it indicated that he had been at the crime scene.
This time, Gordon decided to talk. He told Rutland Detective Shawwecker that around 10:30 a.m. on November 1st, Janet and her 25-year-old daughter, Melody, had picked him up from his house in a rental vehicle that Janet had gotten from New York. Gordon explained that he had no idea anything nefarious was going to happen. He didn't even know that they were heading to Lynn and Gina's place. It was only after he got into the car that Janet mentioned they were driving to Middleton to visit Gina.
It was a 3-hour trip. Gordon said along the way, the group listened to old songs on the radio and they sang along to them, and the mood was happy and light. Gordon stated that after arriving in Connecticut, the group drove to the Wesleyan Hills subdivision, and Melody parked the rental car a little bit away from Lynn's house, and Gordon and Janet got out and walked towards a residence. Gordon claimed Janet just walked into the front door without even knocking. But because he had never been there before, Gordon said he waited at the front entrance to be invited inside, still claiming he was unaware that Janet was there to cause harm. But right away, I'm thinking, why didn't you park in the driveway? Right? They're like, oh, she parked a distance away from the house.
Gordon claimed that while he was still outside, he heard 4 or 5 gunshots, followed by a woman's voice crying out that Janet had hurt her and telling her to get out. He said that he ran inside and into the kitchen where the sounds were coming from and saw Janet fighting with Lynn. Janet screamed at him to help hold Lynn down, while Lynn desperately screamed at him to call 911.
Yeah, and I feel so bad for Lynn in this moment because she saw this random guy entering the house and she probably thought this might be a neighbor or something, not knowing that it was actually Janet's friend there to help hurt her.
Gordon told Detective Shawwecker that he moved toward the phone to call police. But before he could, Janet suddenly cut the line with the knife that she was already holding. She then turned and began stabbing Lynn in the neck with it.
Oh my God, but I'm sitting here thinking, did he really not know that this was the plan? Why would Janet intentionally bring one of her daughters as a witness and her friend to a crime scene? It sounds really odd.
Gordon claimed he didn't see the entire stabbing because his view of Lynn, who was lying on the kitchen floor, was blocked by Janet's body as she stood over her. However, he could tell Janet was stabbing Lynn by the motion of her arm moving up and down and by where she was aiming on Lynn's body. Gordon continued by saying that Janet then smashed a lamp over Lynn's head and a mason jar over Ronnie's before stabbing him. During this, Janet cut her hand on the broken mason jar. Gordon said that after this, Janet turned to him and declared that he was now an accomplice to what had just happened. That threat was why he didn't tell investigators the full truth from the start. Gordon said that after both Ronnie and Lynn appeared to be dead, he and Janet fled the house and returned to where Melody was waiting in the parked car. The three of them got into the car and drove away from the scene, but on their way out of Middleton, they pulled over and Janet got out and walked to a nearby pond, where she returned a short time later. She told Gordon that the gun was gone. After they arrived back in Rutland, Gordon said he helped bandage Janet's hand at the apartment and gave her a change of clothes. Later, they returned the rental car to New York.
So Gordon basically claimed that he had no idea what Janet had planned, and he didn't participate in the killings.
Right, and he added that he didn't even know Janet had brought a gun with her.
But then why wouldn't you run to get help? Like if I saw something like this, I would be out of there in a second. But I guess it was because Janet threatened him, and she did have a gun at this point. So he really might have thought he was going to be an accomplice, but I don't know. Renting a car, driving 3 hours in the first place unplanned seems awfully suspicious. I mean, wouldn't he have noted that this needed to be in advance? Like, oh, you're just coming to pick me up for a 6-hour car drive because you got to consider coming back. Well, of course, the next person detectives want to speak to was Janet's daughter, Melody. Initially, she said that she was at work the whole day at the same ski resort where Janet and Gordon also worked. So all three of them were employed at the same place. But when detectives told her they knew she was lying, Melody changed her story. She then corroborated Gordon's evidence regarding the lead up to the murders and what had occurred afterward. According to Melody, as far as she knew, she was just driving her mom and Gordon to Connecticut to do some shopping and then visit Gina. Melody said that she dropped her mom and Gordon off near Red Orange Road and went to buy some cigarettes because her mom told her to, which she didn't expect would take too long. But Melody got lost on the way back to Wesleyan Hills. Remember, we didn't have phone GPS and things like that. When she found her bearings and returned to the house, she saw her mom and Gordon standing outside waiting for her. Melody said it was at that point that she noticed her mom's hand was cut and bleeding. Janet told her they were leaving, which surprised Melody. When she asked her mom what happened, she said that she cut herself and that Gina wasn't home. Melody wasn't involved in the plot, she claimed, and had no idea what happened inside that house. If her mom had done what police believed, Melody told them Janet wouldn't have been in her right mind. She'd apparently had a history of blacking out and also been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And I'm thinking, okay, what does that have to do with bringing a gun to your ex-girlfriend's new girlfriend's house on a 3-hour drive? She wasn't blacked out on the 3-hour drive. But Melody is alleging that sometime in this short amount of time that they were there, something triggered her mom to black out. And what does MS have to do with all this?
Maybe insinuating that she was too weak in her physical state to carry out a murder?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. But it doesn't take much to point a gun at someone and pull a trigger.
Right. Melody admitted that she overheard her mom and Gordon talking at work the day after the murders, which gave her a terrible feeling that they knew about the crime. She told the detectives that she didn't tell anyone because she wanted to push those awful thoughts out of her mind.
I call BS. I mean, the reason she didn't come forward to me is that she wanted to protect her mother. She knew. And I'm sure she realized that they had been in that exact location and her mom was Gina's ex and she was cut. I mean, come on. Like put 1, 2, 3 together. You know what I'm saying? But going back to Gordon, while you might have assumed from his initial account that Janet owned this gun that Gordon mentioned, given that she was the one using it and later disposing of it, that wasn't true. Gordon finally admitted to police that the firearm was actually his. So he gave her the gun too? Well, somewhat conveniently for him, he claimed no, he didn't give it to her for the crime. He gave her the gun a month earlier, before the murders, but not to kill anyone. It was so that she could get it repaired for him. Gordon said that he tried to take his own life after his grandma had died recently, but somehow he jammed bullets into the gun and it became inoperable. So Gordon stated he hadn't come forward earlier about the murders because Janet threatened to kill a close friend of his if he told anyone. Police didn't take any action against Gordon or Melody for now, but I think you understand now they have enough evidence to arrest Janet on the 2 counts of murder.
Exactly. As expected, on November 9th, Janet was charged and held on 1 count of capital felony due to the allegation that she had murdered more than one person, an aggravating circumstance. She was held without bail and awaited extradition to Connecticut. If convicted on capital charges, Janet faced either the death penalty or life without parole. Despite the charges, Janet remained mostly silent with law enforcement. When asked if she was responsible for the murders, she insisted that she couldn't kill anyone and maintained her innocence.
Gina, meanwhile, was in a complete state of disbelief. She didn't understand how Janet could be responsible. Gina had never heard her ex say one bad thing about Lynn. Everything had seemed perfectly amicable between all of the women, who even socialized together on more than one occasion. But Lynn's family was relieved that an arrest had been made, and relatively quickly. But they didn't have much information at this stage, and they were waiting to learn more from detectives. They weren't the only ones who didn't have much information about what was going on, because the judges in this case decided to order that the arrest warrants both remain sealed for the time being. So this limited the amount of information that was released to the public. We've seen this many times, and even back then, even more. So everyone was left to wonder what was going on. And Gina, knowing everybody involved, it was really concerning. And those who know Janet, from her family to her coworkers, they were shocked when they heard the news of her arrest. They didn't believe it could be true. And I'm sure with the lack of details, they may have assumed the police even got it wrong. But I think we know otherwise. But just wait, because this is not a cut and dry case. It never is.
Exactly. Janet wasn't going to go down without a fight. Through her attorney, she contested the extradition from Vermont to Connecticut. This led the Connecticut governor to initiate the process through Vermont's governor, which could take up to 90 days, an unnecessarily long wait for Lynn and Ronnie's grieving families. At Janet's arraignment in Rutland District Court, an additional charge of being a fugitive from justice was added to her list of charges.
Defendants do this all the time. They try to prolong everything for their own well-being and whatever they want to do, and this is so terrible for families.
While authorities worked through the necessary red tape to have Janet extradited, Middleton investigators issued a public request for any residents who might have seen a red 4-door American late model vehicle, possibly an out-of-state Dodge rental, in the Wesleyan Hills area between 3 and 4 p.m. on the day of the murders. Detectives believed Janet hadn't acted alone and needed more evidence to potentially charge others, such as Gordon or Melody. However, their names were not being disclosed to the reporters at that point.
But things were actually happening very quickly. By November 10th, Middleton investigators located a vital piece of evidence with the help of Gordon. He led them right to that pond where he stated that Janet had disposed of the gun. It was situated near one of the entrances to Wesleyan Hills, at the South Main Street and Wesleyan Hills Road entrance behind the Cypress Restaurant and Grill at 1265 South Main Street. Now, this location happened to be along a route that the detectives believed Janet had taken as she fled from Middleton. And this was a mile from the crime scene. Police divers found the firearm in the man-made pond, less than 3 feet deep, surrounded by trees and bushes on 3 sides. When the .32 caliber Smith & Wesson was recovered, it was a revolver, by the way, it was still in its holster, and it was sent to the crime lab for testing. Now, by the way, I forgot to mention this. This was like an antique gun. It wasn't one that you would usually see being bought in a store anytime in the recent past. Although Lynn and Ronnie had been laid to rest in Hoosick Falls back on November the 5th, a memorial service was held for the pair on November 18th. At Wesleyan's University Memorial Chapel. 100 people from the university joined Lynn and Ronnie's families to pay their respects, and money was even being raised to buy savings bonds for Lynn's son, Matthew, who, don't forget, he was only 10 years old, and he just lost his mother so suddenly and brutally. It was incredibly distressing for this young boy and his entire family.
In December, Janet finally stopped fighting extradition. The governors of both states signed the warrant, and Janet was brought back to Middleton later that month. She was formally charged, fingerprinted, and held on a $750,000 bond. Janet also gained the grim distinction of being the first woman in Connecticut to face trial on a capital felony charge.
Which is another reason I wanted to do this case, because it's not all the time we discuss female perpetrators, especially murderers.
Janet didn't enter a plea at her arraignment on December 30th, but she was assigned new public defenders, Richard Kelly and James McKay. At the pretrial hearing on February 18th of 1994, the chilling tape recording from the Holmes answering machine was played for everyone present to hear.
Yeah, and this was the first time anyone except for the authorities were hearing this tape. Gina and another witness, who I'm going to get to in a second, both told the court that the voices on the tape were those of Lynn, Janet, and Gordon. Ballistic testing conducted by the state police firearms analyst had since revealed that 3 of the bullets lodged in Lynn and Ronnie's bodies came from this 100-year-old revolver found in the pond. Detectives had learned by this point how Gordon had even come to get this antique gun. His father, Gordon Sr., stated that he gave the weapon and some bullets to his son just a month before the murders as a gift in return for Gordon buying him a TV. Interesting. Gordon and Melody were also in court that day, and they had their own public defenders. They hadn't been charged with any crimes, but they both pled the fifth and remained silent up until this point. Gordon's account had been that he was a bystander in the whole thing. But that was until that witness I told you about came forward. She was a friend of his and Janet's, 36-year-old Natalie Jurgen, who was also their coworker as well as Janet's landlord. Okay. And Natalie was granted immunity from prosecution for providing evidence against Janet. Wait until you hear this.
Natalie, who had known Janet since around 1991 and was close friends with Gina, informed investigators and testified in court that in months leading up to the murders, she and Janet had made 4 trips from Vermont to Middleton between August 14th and November 1st. During these trips, Janet familiarized herself with the location of Lynn's home and the layout of Westland Hills. Initially, Janet told Natalie she wanted to vandalize Lynn's vehicle by writing homophobic slurs on it with a permanent marker. She never followed through with this. On a subsequent trip, a few weeks later, Janet took photographs of Lynn's car at Wesleyan University. Things then took a darker turn. Janet confided to Natalie that she wanted to kill Lynn to get Gina back, claiming that Lynn had ruined her life. Janet outlined a plan to ambush Lynn on her way to work, specifically targeting a quiet area near Brush Hill Road. Her plan was to follow Lynn's car, wait for her to stop at a stop sign, shoot her, and then set the vehicle on fire.
And she thought no one was going to see this in the middle of the day, on the way to work, at a stop sign.
I guess not, but it doesn't seem like Janet thinks things through very well.
Janet actually asked Natalie to drive her to Connecticut to carry out the murder, showing Natalie a black cap, gloves, and the revolver that she had in a bag. And Natalie was like, no, I'm not doing this. She told Janet she was crazy. Good for her. But then crazy Janet threatened to kill Natalie's children. And the way that Janet was acting, Natalie thought that she was serious, and she had no choice but to do as she was told. So Janet and Natalie again drive to Middleton, but Janet didn't follow through because Lynn took a different route home from work, different than the one they were expecting. And by the way, I used to do that too. I don't drive right now anymore, so it's not really applying to me. But my dad would always tell me, don't take the same route. I don't care if it's quicker. I don't care if it's a shortcut. He would always tell me that. So he taught that to me at a young age. But at this point, Natalie was really done. She didn't want to go any further and have any part of Janet's murderous plan. So she refused to drive her to Middleton again. The reason why Natalie gave for not telling anyone about Janet's intentions prior to the murders was again because she was afraid of Janet's threat of harming Natalie and her children or anyone else in her life. So she didn't stop her from carrying it out. Natalie said that in early October, Janet told her that her friend Gordon had now agreed to help her. And Natalie was surprised to hear that, saying that Gordon was going to be her accomplice. It was because of what we know about Gordon's stature. And also she knew more about his personality. He was on the thinner side and he didn't have an imposing physical presence or a personality from what she knew of him. Natalie could not see him agreeing to hurt anyone, let alone participate in a cold-blooded murder. The day after the February pretrial hearing, Judge O'Keefe ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. And of course, Janet pleaded not guilty to all charges.
As we mentioned, many people in Janet's life were shocked by the accusations of murder. She didn't have a criminal record, so how could she be capable of committing not just 1, but 2 brutal murders? To provide more context and perspective, we thought we'd share more about Janet's background. Janet May Griffin was born on July 22, 1946, in Springfield, Vermont, as the second youngest of 5 children to her parents, Harry and Esther. In October 1975, Janet married John Jasmine, and they had 5 children together. As an adult, Janet's work history was varied. Starting in 1977, she worked intermittently as a nursing assistant. In 1986, she took a job as a corrections officer at Rutland Jail, but was fired after just 5 months for fraternizing with an inmate.
In other words, she was hooking up with the inmate, having a relationship with said inmate, being inappropriate with this inmate while on the job.
Exactly, and the following year, Janet and her husband John divorced, though they stayed in touch and co-parented their children. Janet also worked at a local Kmart and served as a teacher's aide at Brandon Training School, which provided education and support for students with special needs.
And I don't know how y'all are going to feel about this next part. I feel like it gives us a lot more insight into who Gina was or who she became. Gina had actually known Janet her whole life. And there was a big age gap. Remember that? Between the two, they were 23 years apart. And here's the thing. Janet used to be Gina's babysitter. That is how they met. And I got to say, that made me feel really weird about this whole situation. After not seeing each other for many years, though, one day in 1990, then 22-year-old Gina ran into 44-year-old Janet downtown. And at that time, things were not going well in Janet's world. Her marriage to John had broken down. She was living in her car. And Gina, feeling like, this lady was the one to watch her as a child, she offered Janet to come live with her. She also got Janet a job as a housekeeper at the ski resort where Gina was working as an executive housekeeper. And Gina soon became Janet's supervisor. And then, of course, eventually, the two were in a romantic relationship. And I mean, they were 2 consenting adults. I guess it just struck me as odd that Janet used to babysit Gina. Maybe it's not as weird as it first seemed to me now, but I don't know. What do you guys think? My first thought was that Gina would feel kind of obligated, like almost to the point that she would be influenced by the fact that she grew up with Janet as a caregiver and an authority figure. And Janet had much more life experience and was going through a weird time in her life. But I'm not privy to their entire connection. But anyway, the pair lived and worked together, but eventually it was Gina who broke things off in June of 1992. Janet was a homebody. She liked to knit and be indoors, while Gina was an extrovert who was very energetic. She liked spending time with others and very social and enjoyed sports. But even though they broke up, they continued living together. They even moved into a new house that Gina and her father had bought. But in January of 1993, Gina gave Janet 6 months' notice to move out. And Janet was incredibly upset and still very much in love with Gina. But Gina reiterated that they'd been broken up for 6 months and she would not be getting back together with her. Gina definitely hadn't been stringing Janet along. She knew full well what Gina's intentions were. It was simply a case of unrequited love, which again made me think that this is more of a relationship of convenience. Like Janet was more into this younger woman than Gina was into Janet. But she kind of just fell into this relationship and finally realized that Janet was not the one for her.
It could be that Gina had been trying to distance herself for a while, but felt obligated to be kind to Janet due to their shared history. 4 months later, in April, Janet finally moved out into an apartment owned by her friend and coworker, Natalie, whom we mentioned earlier. Even after their breakup, Janet and Gina remained friends and even commuted to work together. Janet had no idea that Gina had started dating Lynn at this time, which was, of course, Gina's private life and not any of Janet's concern. However, when Janet eventually found out that Gina had not only moved on, but also was planning to move in with Lynn, she became incredibly angry. Janet often confided in Natalie about how she felt and still loved Gina and wanted her back. She even told Gina directly that moving in with Lynn was the biggest mistake of her life. Even after Gina moved to Connecticut and was happily living with Lynn, Janet continued to contact her frequently. Gina, trying to stay on relatively good terms and not wanting to hurt Janet further, kept responding despite the persistent calls.
But Janet never revealed to Gina how much she resented Lynn, despite telling a coworker in mid-August that Lynn was a kite lut. Okay, it rhymes with kite lut, but it starts with a D and an S. Okay, which was completely ironic given the fact that Janet was also gay. So she was making a reference to that. I think you know. We can't say it. It's just really odd that she would do that and make that remark if it applied. I don't know. Very weird. And then she issued Gina an ultimatum. If Gina didn't want to be with Janet, then Janet didn't want to be friends with her anymore. That's kind of immature. But I would be like, good riddance. Like, it doesn't seem Gina even wanted anything to do with Janet at this point, but Gina was disappointed that it had come to this. However, she wouldn't be bullied. So she told Janet that if that was the case, then she accepted their friendship was officially over. And she was okay with that. Well, that's when Janet soon changed her mind, telling Gina, you know what? No, I want to remain friends, hoping that everyone could just get along. And that's why, oddly, Gina now suggested that Janet meet Lynn. I have to think that that was probably not a good idea. I think those things should remain separate. I see no reason an ex should meet your new partner, but that's just me. I mean, they're an ex for a reason, right?
And I agree with you. I think it's wild that she would use those nasty terms about Lynn, especially since she was gay too.
I think, though, it might have had something to do with the fact that Janet was Gina's first experience of that kind. And now she's going on and replacing her with this other woman. And I feel like Janet felt like she introduced her to that, you know, like it was new to her.
And when Gina tried to keep things civil by suggesting Janet meet Lynn, it totally backfired. Reminds me of why setting boundaries is so important. Janet refused to meet Lynn and instead demanded that when Gina came home to visit, she come alone to Janet's place without Lynn. But Gina wasn't having it. By early October, she'd had enough and told Janet she wouldn't be visiting anymore. If Janet wanted to see her, she'd have to come over when both Lynn and Gina were home. Janet's response was unsettling. She said, I don't know what would happen if I saw you two together.
Adding that she didn't know what she was capable of. And I mean, that should be a huge red flag. And then Gina gets a threatening anonymous letter sent to the house at Red Orange Road, not long after she moved in with Lynn. And it warned Gina to leave, to break up with Lynn and move out because supposedly Lynn was a drug dealer. And this was completely not true and deeply unsettling for Lynn. Gina wasn't even concerned, though. She thought it was a former disgruntled employee of hers that she had just fired. And that was it. She somehow didn't connect the dots and realize that this was Janet.
Then on October 4th, about a month before the murders, Janet and her daughter Melody made an unplanned trip to Connecticut to visit Gina at her home, saying they were on their way to shop in Albany, New York. Surprisingly, it turned into a pleasant visit, and Janet and Lynn actually got along well.
Right, so her ex comes over unannounced, and Gina's trying to smooth things over by introducing the two women who acted mature about the whole thing. And I mean, they were both in their 40s, and it seemed like everything was okay. While hanging out, Gina told a slightly embarrassing yet funny story about how she recently found herself locked out of the house after forgetting her keys. And of course, not wanting to wait until Lynn or Ronnie came home, she was able to maneuver herself through the dog door. Suddenly, an idea sparked in Janet's mind. Who did she know that would be able to squeeze through that same dog door? Because she was already in planning mode by this time. This trip was planned. I think you know exactly who she recruited.
Butch,
AKA Gordon.
Investigators had been working hard since Janet's arrest to secure a warrant to arrest Gordon as an accessory to murder. Witnesses had seen a man walking with Janet on the afternoon of the murder, and Janet had used Gordon's nickname on the recording. Both Gina and Natalie identified the male voice on the tape as Gordon, and he didn't have an alibi.
Exactly. And I mean, this is circumstantial. We know that, but they've got enough to arrest him. So May 20th, 1994, Gordon was arrested as a fugitive of justice, given that he lived out of state at the time, and he was held on a $500,000 bond. If convicted, he was facing 25 years to life in prison. Unlike Janet, Gordon didn't fight his extradition to Connecticut and was taken to Middleton without an issue. Knowing that he was in big trouble, he finally revealed more information. He told the police that he and Janet hadn't entered the home through the unlocked front door. Remember that? At first he said, oh, she walked right in. I stayed on the patio. Instead, he said that Janet pulled out Gordon's gun, held it to his head, and threatened to kill him if he didn't squeeze through the dog door and then unlock the front door to let her in. Now, this might sound like something that's almost impossible, but Gordon wasn't a big guy. He was able to manage it. And I just got to say, wow. Gina was devastated at this news. because now they're arresting one of her friends. She had known him a long time. She met him during her early teens, and now she had been completely betrayed by not one, but two people that she trusted. Janet had even thrown her a farewell party when she moved to Connecticut just months before. What a fake friend, and so conniving and manipulative.
By now, investigators had pieced together a likely sequence of events from the statements provided from Gordon, Natalie, and Melody. It appeared that when Gina moved in with Lynn, Janet began formulating her plan. Driven by a mix of revenge, jealousy, and obsession, Janet was determined to win Gina back at any cost.
Even if it meant killing her girlfriend and hoping that she would run back into her arms for comfort, which is exactly what happened.
Janet asked Gordon for his gun, and after Natalie refused to drive her to Middleton for a fifth time, she convinced Gordon to go with her instead. Janet arranged to rent a car from a New York agency that didn't require a credit card. On November 1st, Janet, Gordon, and Melody picked up the vehicle and set off toward Middleton. After arriving and being dropped off by Melody near the house, Janet forced Gordon at gunpoint to crawl through the dog door and unlock the sliding glass door, only to close it and lock it behind them. Janet and Gordon hid in the house, waiting for Lynn to return. However, they didn't anticipate Ronnie being there. When Lynn and Ronnie came home from work, they parked in the garage and entered through the house through the back door, which led directly into the kitchen. Janet didn't hesitate. As soon as she heard someone entering the home, she ambushed Lynn, firing and hitting her 3 times. Ronnie, who was also there, was caught in the crossfire and was shot once. Gordon, standing just outside the kitchen and around the corner, turned to see Janet attacking Lynn, who, despite her bullet wounds, was fighting back with all her strength. The two women struggled around the room as Lynn desperately tried to escape, pleading with Janet to stop and just leave. Lynn's voice was filled with fear as she begged Janet not to hurt her any further.
I can't believe that Lynn is still up and fighting after she has been shot. That's probably why Janet grabbed a knife from the knife block, and as she was heading in Lynn's direction, she cut the phone lines so that no one could call for help. But somehow the answering machine was activated and the tape began recording at that time, unbeknownst to anyone in that house.
With Lynn now on the floor, Janet began stabbing her with a knife. When the knife became lodged into Lynn's neck, Janet demanded another one, and Gordon rummaged through a kitchen drawer before handing her another knife. Janet then stabbed Lynn in the back, cutting her own hand in the process, before finally grabbing a lamp and smashing it over Lynn's head.
It's so cold and so callous to me. Killing Ronnie had never even been part of Lynn's plan, and for him, it was just a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Even though Ronnie wasn't the intended target, it was apparently Gordon who told Janet to finish him. We can't be sure who Janet was hurting in that very moment, but you can hear Gordon say, "Do it," and then a man groaning right before this. But Lynn was also still begging Janet not to do whatever it was that she was doing next, which was apparently stabbing Ronnie and smashing the mason jar over his head to make sure he was dead. After fleeing Connecticut and disposing of the gun, Gordon helped Janet clean the rental car before they returned it to New York. So he was definitely a part of this crime, a big part. And that's why on June 1st, Gordon was arraigned on 1 count of accessory to murder and Lynn slaying, and he was later charged in relation to Ronnie's murder, and on August 31st was charged with a capital felony. This charge was added because the assistant state's attorney had successfully argued that even though Ronnie wasn't the intended victim, he had died as a result of the planned attack. Gordon pleaded not guilty on 2 charges of intentionally aiding in the commission of the murders and capital felony. But now he too would be facing the death penalty if convicted.
By this time, the results of blood and DNA testing had come back. One of the bloody knives found at the crime scene contained the DNA of 3 people, Lynn, Ronnie, and Janet. Blood-like stains were also discovered in the red rental car. Forensic analysis determined that the blood found on the front door, the stairway wall, and the ground outside the house did not belong to either victim. Additionally, blood found on Lynn and Ronnie's boots and Ronnie's clothing matched a genetic marker consistent with Janet's blood.
They definitely have Janet, but I think pinning things on Gordon would be harder, except for, of course, hearing him saying, "Do it" on the tape. That's pretty incriminating.
In March 1996, after 2 months of jury selection and just before Janet's trial was set to start, a major development occurred. The defense filed a motion for a mistrial.
Yes, and we know that the tape was going to be a huge part of the prosecution's case, but a media publication called the Hartford Courant got access to it, and they published the transcript, and the defense was already in the process of trying to argue to get the tape excluded from this entire trial because they were saying it wasn't authentic, and it was only partially audible, and therefore it was misleading and prejudicial. But how is it not authentic? It came right from Lynn's own house.
Right. The defense will often try anything to challenge the prosecution and make them prove their case. The prosecution countered by arguing that the contents of the tape had already been made public during the pretrial hearings back in February 1994. But the authenticity of the tape was still in question. The issue was that the witnesses like Gina and Natalie were the ones identifying the voices, and neither of them had actually been present when the recording was made. This left room for the defense to challenge the validity of the evidence.
What would have worked in the prosecution's favor was just to have Gordon testify about the identities on that tape. However, he had invoked his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent so that he wouldn't incriminate himself. In the end, Judge Thomas Miano decided to wait and make a ruling on the tape's admissibility during the actual trial so that they could just get things moving at this point. Finally, 49-year-old Janet's trial got underway on March 25th, 1996. The prosecution told the court that Janet was motivated by revenge. When Gina split up with her and began dating Lynn, Janet was not happy. She wanted Gina back. In her eyes, Lynn was the one responsible for Gina breaking things off with her. But that actually wasn't true. It didn't matter, though. Janet figured if Lynn was hypothetically no longer around, then there would be no obstacle to getting back with Gina.
The prosecution highlighted that Lynn had been stabbed in the face, pointing to this as evidence of Janet's all-consuming rage and jealousy. This act, they argued, symbolized Janet's attempt to obliterate the identity of the person she saw as a rival.
It was certainly difficult for Lynn and Ronnie's families who were attending the trial to listen to. With the prosecution having presented its witnesses, there was still the matter of whether the jury would hear that tape recording. Judge Miano ultimately allowed it to be played 3 times, much to the frustration of the defense. And Gina became overwhelmed with emotion as the tape recording was played over and over again in court, testifying that the voice on the tape was indeed Lynn, Janet, and Gordon. Even though only 3 voices could be heard speaking on the tape, Ronnie's father, Fred, testified that the sounds of the male groaning on the tape was his son. He said that it was like he was in so much agony, just trying to hold on to his life. Can you imagine having to confirm that that's the sound of your son dying? That is heartbreaking. And what can the defense say now?
Well, they tried to use the blood evidence to actually rule out Janet.
How? Her blood was there at the house.
Well, the defense claimed it wasn't a definitive identifying tool like fingerprints were.
Excuse me?
Neither Janet's fingerprints nor Gordon's were found at the scene either, so the defense argued it was all circumstantial.
Blood being there is not circumstantial. Her blood was mixed with Ronnie's and Lynn's. Janet didn't take the stand in her defense, and her attorneys only called one witness. One. It was Gordon's lawyer, which was kind of weird. Basically, the defense was trying to create doubt as to whose blood was in the stairwell and on the ground outside because those tests were not conclusive. Okay, so we got reasonable doubt here. And since Gordon himself wouldn't testify, his lawyer did, to at least say that the investigators didn't take Gordon's blood when he was arrested because he didn't have any injuries. So to the defense, this meant it could be Gordon's blood. But I'm thinking, we already know they were both there because of the recording. So it's obvious that it was Janet who cut herself while she was stabbing Lynn or hitting her with the glass. So why are they even going through this? It's almost just to confuse the jury.
Yeah, the defense argued that even experts like Dr. Lee, highly respected in the field of forensic science, definitively determined the sequence of events during the murder. They used this to claim that it was impossible to convict Janet on 2 counts of murder, let alone the capital felony charge.
Why? Because they're claiming that Gordon did it?
Well, they don't have to prove anything, they just have to create reasonable doubt.
Okay, that's true. So what happened?
After 2.5 days of deliberation on April 22nd, the jury found Janet guilty of both counts of murder and capital felony.
As they should have. Lynn and Ronnie's families, as well as Gina, cried with relief as the verdict was being announced. Now for the sentencing. For Janet to be sentenced to death, there would need to be aggravating factors for both the murders and no mitigating factors. and it's the defense's job to bring those factors to light if they exist.
The defense pointed out that Janet had no prior criminal record and was known by her family and friends as a loving, dedicated mother and grandmother. She had coached softball, been active in Girl Scouts, and volunteered with firefighters. Health-wise, her condition had worsened dramatically since her arrest due to multiple sclerosis, to the point where she had to attend many of her court proceedings in a wheelchair.
Or that could have been for show, not to minimize anyone suffering from such a debilitating disease, but I tend to lean toward a defendant like this using whatever they can to their advantage. But now came the defense really trying to make everyone feel sorry for her.
They even had Clinton Roberts, a private investigator, delve deeper into Janet's background, sharing details with the court about her upbringing. After her parents' divorce when she was just 8 years old, Janet went to live with her father, Harry. Home life, however, had never been happy, and she had a strained relationship with her emotionally distant mother, Esther.
I feel like that's half the population or more. I mean, I think we can all relate to something similar in our life. And Janet wasn't an angel. She was actually sent to reform school for 6 months at the age of 16 for stealing a car. She left home by the time she was 18, and she had been married for at least 2 years at that point, and not to her husband that we mentioned named John. This man was named Gordon Stewart, different Gordon, and he was 20 years old at the time, and the couple had a child together. However, they later divorced.
The defense went on to describe how Janet married her second husband, John, and their family grew. For 6 years, Janet even took on the legal parenting responsibilities for a student with profound disabilities from the school where she had been working.
But things fell apart again and followed with her second divorce. And none of these divorces are really seen as a negative per se, but it shows an instability in her life that led to her mental distress. But I really don't think this is an excuse or a mitigating factor. I think you should leave a relationship if it's not going well. But I know for Janet, it led to significant mental strife. And that's when she started living with and dating Gina.
It was a significant decision for the jury, especially given that no one, man or woman, had been executed in Connecticut since 1960. After careful consideration, on May 22nd, the jury recommended that Janet receive life without parole rather than the death penalty. However, it was ultimately up to the judge to make the final decision.
On June 17th, before final sentencing was passed, Gina gave a moving victim impact statement to the court. Lynn and Ronnie were two of the most beautiful people that she had ever met, and Gina would live with what happened every day for the rest of her life, including Janet's betrayal. The judge remarked that the double murder was one of the coldest, deliberate, and calculated crimes he had ever seen in his entire career, and commented on how shocked he was by Janet's totally indifferent demeanor during the trial. In the judge's words, Janet was a disgrace to her family, community, and society in general, who was purely motivated by selfish desire and whose crime outraged every citizen of their state. But in the end, the judge agreed with the jury and sentenced Janet to life in prison without parole. But he commented to Janet that she was lucky that she was prosecuted under Connecticut's former death penalty statute, because the new one that was in place, it was very possible that there would have been a different outcome.
Lynn and Ronnie's families were disappointed by the jury's decision. To them, Janet deserved the harshest punishment possible. Ronnie's younger sister, Sherry, spoke to reporters afterward, expressing that the family understood the jury's legal obligation. They felt Janet's mitigating circumstances should not have influenced the outcome. Sherry pointed out that even in prison, Janet would still have the chance to see her family, while Lynn and Ronnie's loved ones would never be able to see them again.
Exactly, and I know so many families that feel the exact same way. Ronnie's father, Fred, believed an eye for an eye, and he was very angry. But the family knew that executing Janet wasn't going to bring Lynn or Ronnie back. Gina told reporters that while the defense pushed the angle of Janet being an incredible mother and grandmother, Lynn had also been an amazing mother, except now she'd been forever robbed of the chance to be a grandmother. And it must have been hard on Gina, knowing that Janet's obsession with her was the reason for the murders. But wait, because it's not over yet. We still have 33-year-old Gordon's outcome. His trial was set to get underway on March 19th of 1997, again before the same Judge Miano. The prosecution had offered Gordon a last-minute plea deal of 45 years in prison in late July, but he turned it down. He wanted to take his chances with the jury, but that was probably not the best idea, especially with that recording as evidence. The prosecution went hard. They presented 150 pieces of evidence.
To make it simple, the prosecution argued that Gordon wasn't just present when the murders happened. He went on a trip with Janet to scope out Lynn's house, essentially stalking her. He provided the gun and assisted Janet, which was evident from the tape.
Exactly. He handed her the knife that she used to stab Lynn and Ronnie. This was heard on the recording. And this was because the first knife that Janet had used got stuck in Lynn's neck. Again, the tape was played, with Janet clearly heard saying, "I thought you were going to help me." That was straight to Gordon.
However, one could argue that Gordon was hesitating because Janet did say, "I thought you were going to help me."
Right? But he did nothing to stop it. And he did follow through with what she told him to do. He also said, "Do it," as she stabbed Lynn. And he didn't even call the police after the fact. Then the court heard most of the same witnesses from Janet's trial.
The defense argued that Gordon only took part because he feared for his life. They highlighted that when he crawled through the dog door to break in, it was under duress, with Janet holding a gun to his head and threatening to kill him if he didn't follow her instructions and stay quiet. They also pointed out that Gordon handed Janet the second knife and said, "Do it," referring to stabbing Lynn, not as encouragement, but out of fear and a desperate wish to end the situation and leave.
Yeah, basically the defense was trying to minimize his role, hoping that they could get a lesser charge because they were saying, no, he only said like, "Do it and let's go" and everything because he wanted to leave. They wanted to get a charge of manslaughter, but that was only if the jury accepted that Gordon was under extreme emotional distress at the time of the double murder. And maybe he was. I mean, Janet was pretty unhinged. She had a gun and knives, but I think by the time she shot both Lynn and Ronnie, she ran out of bullets. And that's why she started using the knives. So he could have ran.
The defense also brought up that Natalie was afraid of Janet and believed that she was capable of killing her own family. And the defense said that Gordon was just as fearful of Janet. Additionally, an expert testified about Gordon's upbringing, explaining that it made him a vulnerable person who was easily influenced by someone like Janet.
Gordon's primary caregiver as a child was his grandmother, with whom he was extremely close. And the expert explained that as a gay man in a small community, Gordon was socially isolated and felt most comfortable around women. Combined with his meek nature, this affected his grades at school and resulted in him developing a passive dependent personality. This made Gordon vulnerable to strong personalities and intimidation, and therefore completely incapable of behaving in a way other than compliant in a stressful situation. Gordon, who was said to have been sickened by even the sight of blood, was also said to have been diagnosed with depression and had tried to take his own life on multiple occasions. And unlike Janet, Gordon decided to take the stand in his own defense.
He broke down in tears as he told the court how he was paralyzed with fear at the crime scene, terrified of what might happen if he didn't follow Janet's orders. He insisted that he had no idea of Janet's true intentions until they reached the back door of the house, where he turned and saw Janet pointing his own gun at him, her expression cold and threatening. He simply thought that they were going to visit Gina so Janet could try to get her back. Gordon testified that once inside the house, Janet waved the gun around and Gordon began crying as he asked Janet why she was doing this, telling her that they could still leave and he promised not to tell anyone. Janet responded that if Gordon just did what she told him, he wouldn't get hurt.
We also learn a lot more details from Gordon when he's on the stand because he hadn't spoken that much about exactly what happened to Lynn and Ronnie, but now you're about to find out exactly what he said happened that day. He said that Janet jumped out from behind a wall and shot Lynn and then slashed the phone cord and began turning the knife on Lynn, and Gordon watched as Lynn clung to the kitchen counter, already with cuts all over her face. He claimed that he just froze with fear, and Janet began screaming at him and just pointing and shaking the gun right in his face and even pulling the trigger. But luckily, she was merely showing him it was out of bullets. And all it was doing was just clicking in his face. Can you imagine? And he's just like, she's just pointing at him like that. And then he said that even if it was him on that tape, he was so out of it, he doesn't even remember what he was saying. On May 15th, after deliberating for 5.5 days, that's a long time, the jury ultimately found Gordon guilty of 2 counts of first-degree manslaughter. They believed he assisted Janet, but that his actions were the direct result of his emotional distress and fear for his own life. Gina, for one, felt that justice had been served. She knew and she loved Gordon. And I do think that the jury possibly got it right, but It doesn't mean Gordon doesn't have to serve a significant sentence.
2 months later, Judge Miano described Gordon as a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary participant who was present to assist Janet. According to the judge, Gordon's tone when saying "do it" to Janet was particularly striking and cold. Despite this, some jurors felt sympathy for Gordon and even wrote to the judge requesting a more lenient sentence. Ultimately, 34-year-old Gordon received a 30-year prison sentence with no possibility of parole for at least 25 and a half years.
That was less than the 40 years for both counts, which was the original sentence on the table. Ronnie's sister Sherry told the court afterward that while nothing could take away the pain that her family had felt over the last 4 years, they could take comfort in knowing that Janet and Gordon were now removed from society, so Lynn and Ronnie's families could get on with their lives. Gordon didn't say anything at sentencing, and apparently he was feeling too emotional to do that. We probably don't need to tell you this, but they both made appeals and neither of them won. And during Janet's stay in prison, the guards reported that she was one of the most difficult inmates they had ever had to deal with, and even called her evil. And it makes me wonder what Gina ever saw in her in the first place. Maybe she was just scared. She went along with her and dated her because of that.
Ultimately, they both got the death sentence in a way because they both died in prison.
I looked this up and couldn't figure out exactly what happened, but from what I could read, it seems like Gordon died in December of 2020 at the age of 62, and Janet died in August of 2022 at the age of 76. Now, the cause of their deaths are not listed. But wow, I mean, if that's true, Gordon only had about 2 years left until he was eligible for parole. Imagine spending 23 years in prison. I think by then you probably get sick of their being there, but you also don't think you're ever going to get out. So you've kind of resigned yourself, because my dad spent less than half of that time in prison and it was brutal, as it should be though, as it should be. It's enough to deter me from considering doing anything illegal. That's why it shocks me that people are still willing to commit crimes.
Yeah, I know, but there are a lot of psychological factors, emotional triggers, socioeconomic circumstances, cultural and social influences, greed and gain, revenge, control and power, impulse and lack of judgment, psychological delusions and beliefs that make people do wild acts of violence.
Or just being narcissistic enough to think you're going to get away with it. How many people are like that? They're like, I'm above the law.
Too many.
Yeah. Cameras, no worries. Phone calls, not a problem. Taking the stand, of course they did. And then you're like, what were you thinking? Because we can see it from the outside. We're like, no. But they're like, no, they're so narcissistic. They don't get it.
Crazy out there.
It really is. So be safe. And we will see you in our very next video. Bye.